She was 22 years old, standing on a wooden platform in the middle of a dying Arizona town, and the men below her were deciding what she was worth. Not who she was, what she was worth. Her father was 3 months in the ground, his debts written in ink that didn't belong to him, and the men holding those papers had waited just long enough after the funeral to make their move. The auctioneer called for bids. The crowd shifted and looked away. And Eliza Hartwell understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water thrown in her face, that not a single person in that town was going to stop this. But if this story already has your heart pounding, you're in the right place. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow this channel all the way to the end. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction was set for noon. By 11, the sun was already punishing. It came down flat and white over the rooftops of Darrow's Crossing, Arizona, a town that existed mostly because the railroad had needed a water stop and nobody had bothered to leave after it was built. The buildings along the main street were the color of old bones. The saloon sign had lost 2 letters and nobody had replaced them. The church still stood, but the minister had moved on 3 years prior, and the building had since been used for grain storage. Eliza Hartwell stood in the narrow alley behind the general store, her back against the wall, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral. Dark blue cotton, already faded at the collar, already too warm for the day. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. There hadn't seemed to be any point. Across the alley, sitting on an upturned crate and smoking a thin cigarette, was a man named Percy Alden. He worked for the auction office, which was not a real office, but a table set up in front of the assayer's building whenever someone needed to liquidate assets. Percy was the one who'd come to the house 2 weeks ago with the paperwork. He'd stood in the doorway of what had been her father's study and laid the documents on the desk with a politeness that made her feel sick, explaining that the debts were substantial and that the estate, being worth considerably less than what was owed, had created a legal complication that the creditors were eager to resolve. She'd asked him who the creditors were. He'd smiled, not unkindly, which was almost worse. "That's a matter between the estate and its obligations, Miss Hartwell." "I'm the estate," she'd said. "Yes," he'd agreed, in a manner of speaking. She hadn't fully understood what that meant until 3 days ago, when another man, broader, less polished than Percy, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, had come to tell her that the auction would be held on the 14th and that she should present herself at the platform by 11:30. "What exactly is being auctioned?" she'd asked him. He'd looked at her the way men looked at things they were already done thinking about. "The resolution of the debt," he'd said. "You'll be spoken for by whoever settles it. That's all you need to know." She'd stood in the doorway of her father's house long after he left, watching the dust his horse raised on the road, and tried to find something, anger, tears, even fear, that might make her feel like a person rather than a line item in someone's ledger. Nothing came, just the heat and the silence and the awareness that she had nobody to call on. Her mother had died when Eliza was 11. She'd had one brother 4 years older who'd gone to find work in California and whose letters had stopped coming 18 months ago. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had been a surveyor by trade and a believer in fairness by nature, which had made him very good at measuring land and very bad at navigating the men who profited from controlling it. He'd had friends, or she'd thought he had, but when his debts became public knowledge, those friends had become careful about their distance in the way that men in small towns always become careful when trouble attaches itself to someone else's name. She'd gone to see the sheriff 2 days after the scarred man's visit. Sheriff Dunmore was 53 years old, had been elected twice by comfortable margins, and had a face that had learned to communicate a profound and genuine regret without ever committing to actually doing anything. He'd listened to her. He'd nodded at the appropriate moments. He'd offered her coffee, which she declined. "There a legal problem with the debt itself?" she asked him. "Not that I can see. Is there a legal problem with the auction?" He shifted. "It's an unusual arrangement, but the documentation's been filed proper." "It's not a property auction," she said. "It's me they're selling." "It's the resolution of a debt obligation," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he'd been told to say it exactly that way. "The winner assumes the debt, and in exchange you're contracted, for a period. It's been done before." "Where?" He didn't answer that. She left his office and went back to the house that would be taken from her regardless of how the auction ended. She sat in her father's study, at his desk, surrounded by his books and his rolled surveys and the smell of the tobacco he'd smoked in the evenings. She went through his papers, not because she thought she'd find anything useful, but because it was something to do with her hands. She found something, in the end. Not useful, not immediately, but something that she folded carefully and put inside the bodice of her dress, against her skin, because she didn't know yet what it meant, but she knew enough to understand that it ought not to be left lying around. The platform was 4 feet off the ground, built from rough-cut pine, and smelled of sawdust and old rain. Someone had nailed a wooden railing along the back edge, which she supposed was to keep whoever was being sold from simply stepping off. There were perhaps 40 people gathered in front of it, maybe more. She didn't count. She stood at the center of the platform in her faded blue dress and kept her eyes on the middle distance, past the crowd, past the storefronts, out toward the pale open land that stretched in every direction beyond the town's edges. Percy Alden stood at the front of the platform with a ledger. He introduced himself to the crowd and gave a brief explanation of the proceedings in the mild and businesslike tone of a man who auctioned people's belongings for a living and had arranged his interior world so that he never had to think too carefully about which category this fell into. She heard him say the amount. It was a number she'd seen on the documents. It had never looked real to her, written down. Hearing it spoken out loud in the noon heat didn't make it more real, just more final. The crowd shifted. There were men near the front she recognized, Callum Ostrander, who owned the biggest cattle operation east of the Palato River, wearing a hat that cost more than her father had made in a good month. Next to him stood 2 men she didn't know, but whose clothes announced clearly that they were not from Darrow's Crossing and had not come for the scenery. Ostrander bid first. His voice was flat and unhurried, like a man purchasing a piece of furniture he'd already decided on before walking into the shop. Someone else bid against him. She didn't see who. Ostrander raised his offer without looking particularly interested in the outcome. She thought about her father. Not the last months, which had been bad. The worry he couldn't hide, the weight that had come into his face and never quite left. She thought about earlier, the evenings in the study, the way he'd call her in to look at his survey maps and explain the land to her in terms of elevation and watershed and soil composition, like the land was a living thing with its own logic that rewarded people who took time to understand it. You pay attention to what's actually there, he used to say, not what people tell you should be there. The land doesn't lie. People lie about it. He'd known something was wrong with the debts. She was almost certain of it now. The paper she'd found in his desk. 1100. The voice came from somewhere behind the crowd. A deep voice, not loud but carrying. The voice of someone who was used to being heard without raising it. The crowd turned. She turned. She couldn't see him clearly at first, just the shape of him, tall, lean, the way a man looks when he's spent years outdoors, and his body has stripped itself of anything that isn't useful. He was walking forward through the gathered townspeople, who were parting for him in that particular way crowds part for people they are genuinely afraid of. He had dark hair, mostly hidden under a battered hat. His face was weathered in a way that made his age difficult to calculate. Could have been 35, could have been 40, could have been older. His clothes were trail-worn but not ragged. He wore a gun the way working men wore tools, functionally, without drama. He walked like someone who had developed the habit of never moving faster than he needed to. She heard the name move through the crowd before he reached the platform. Murmured, passed from person to person, like a match being handed down a line. Maddox. That's Rhett Maddox. She'd heard the name. Everyone in the territory had heard the name. She'd heard it attached to various stories. A range war in New Mexico 3 years back that ended badly for the men who'd started it. A cattle operation he supposedly ran north of Darrow's Crossing. A reputation for the kind of cold and total stillness that men who'd survived violence tended to develop as a matter of ongoing survival. She hadn't heard anything that explained what he was doing at a debt auction in the middle of the week. He stopped at the base of the platform steps and looked up at her. Not in an assessing way. Not the way Ostrander and the other bidders had been looking at her. Just looking, direct and brief, the way you look at someone you want to actually see. Then he looked at Percy Alden. "She isn't for sale," he said. The crowd went very quiet. Percy Alden blinked. His professional composure wobbled for just a moment, like a table with one short leg. "Sir, the auction is in progress. If you'd like to, I said she isn't for sale. Rhett turned to look at Ostrander. And you know it. Ostrander's face didn't change much, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had the look of a man reassessing a situation he'd considered already settled. You've got no business here, Maddox. The debt, Rhett said. He looked back at Percy. Show me the debt documentation. Sir, I'm not authorized to show it to me. There was something in his voice that made the word show feel less like a request and more like an instruction that came with consequences attached. Percy showed him the documents. The crowd watched while Rhett stood at the base of the steps and read through the pages. He took his time. The sun continued its work overhead. Nobody spoke. Ostrander's jaw had tightened slightly. The two men beside him had developed the careful stillness of people who are waiting to see how a thing resolves before deciding their role in it. When Rhett finished reading, he looked up. The primary debt, he said, is a note from the Consolidated Land Bank of Tucson. Is that right? Percy nodded carefully. The Consolidated Land Bank of Tucson closed, Rhett said, 14 months ago. It doesn't exist. It hasn't existed. Which means this note is either worthless or fraudulent, and either way, this auction is over. Ostrander stepped forward. The two men with him moved as well, slightly, in the way that men move when they're accustomed to doing their moving together. You're making a serious mistake, Ostrander said. Rhett looked at him. Just looked. The same way he'd looked at Eliza, direct and without particular agitation, like a man who'd arrived at a place where emotion wasn't especially useful. I've made a few, he said. Usually it was the other person who ended up regretting them. It should have been a threat. It didn't quite come out as one. It came out as a statement about history, dry and without flourish, and somehow that was worse. Ostrander held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. Not quickly, carefully, as if the looking away was its own kind of communication. We're done here, he said to his men, and they walked. The crowd, having been pressing forward in a tight knot, loosened and spread. People began talking in low voices. Percy Alden gathered his papers with the focused attention of a man who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. Eliza remained on the platform. Rhett climbed the steps, 3 of them, and the wood creaked under his boot on the middle one, and stopped in front of her. He was taller than she'd realized. He smelled of horses and road dust and something else, faintly, like wood smoke. Do you have somewhere to go? He asked her. I have a house, she said. For now. They'll come back. I know. He nodded. He seemed to be considering something. She waited because there didn't seem to be anything useful she could say, and she was done for the moment with talking to men who held pieces of her future in their hands. The debt documentation, he said. There's more to it than what Alden was showing. You know anything about your father's financial records? Some, she said carefully. More than some? She looked at him, trying to determine what kind of man he was, the way she'd been trying to determine that since he walked through the crowd. She didn't have enough information yet. She didn't know why he'd come, or what he wanted, or whether his intervention had been on her behalf or on behalf of something else entirely. Why'd you come here? She asked him. He was quiet for a moment. Knew your father, he said. Not well. Surveying work a few years back. He was a decent man. He's dead. I know, I heard. He said it simply, without the softening that people usually put around those words. She found she didn't mind it. I heard the circumstances, too. Came to see if what I heard was right. And? It's worse than I heard, he said, numb. He walked with her back to the house. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't offered. He'd simply descended the platform steps beside her and fallen into step, and she'd let it happen, because the alternative was walking through the remnants of the crowd alone, and she was tired enough that the social mechanics of refusing didn't seem worth the effort. They didn't talk on the way. The street was emptying in the sluggish way of midday, the heat pressing people toward shade. Someone called out from a doorway, a woman's voice, she didn't catch the words, and Rhett tipped his hat without turning his head. The house was on the east side of town, a quarter-mile from the main street, set back from the road behind a stand of scrubby cottonwoods that had been her father's one concession to aesthetics in an otherwise practical existence. It was a wooden house with a covered porch, 2 stories, solidly built. Thomas Hartwell had spent 2 months on the construction and done most of it himself. The inside was cluttered with the specific kind of clutter that accumulates when a practical person lives alone for years. Books stacked on every flat surface, rolled maps in the corners, coats hanging on pegs beside equipment she had no name for. She made coffee. It was something to do. She was aware of Rhett sitting at the kitchen table, and she was aware of herself at the stove. And she was aware, distantly and without particular feeling, that 24 hours ago she'd believed she was about to spend the rest of her life contracted to a man chosen by an auction. And now she was in her father's kitchen making coffee for a stranger who'd stopped it from happening. And she had no model in her experience for how to think about any of this. "What kind of work did you do for my father?" she asked. "He was surveying a land grant northwest of here, double-checking boundary lines for a dispute between two ranchers. He needed a second set of eyes, someone who knew the terrain and wasn't hired by either party." He paused. "We spent about 2 weeks in the field. He was particular about getting things right." He was. He also asked questions about who owned what and who'd acquired what when. More questions than a boundary survey usually requires. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. "What kind of questions?" "The kind a man asks when he's noticed something that doesn't add up, and he's trying to understand the shape of it before he does anything about it." She reached inside the front of her dress and took out the folded paper. She'd been carrying it there since the night she'd found it. She smoothed it on the table between them. It was a handwritten list in her father's close, precise script: property parcel numbers, names, dates, and brief notations beside each entry. She'd recognized some of the parcel numbers from his survey maps, but hadn't known what to make of the rest of it until the auction, until Rhett's comment about the land bank. He looked at it without touching it, read through it slowly. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "His desk, under the lining of the bottom drawer." He looked up at her. "You knew what it was?" "Not exactly. I knew it was something he'd hidden." He read it again. His face was difficult to read. Not unexpressive exactly, but controlled, like someone who'd learned to keep the reaction separate from the processing. "These parcel numbers," he said. "I know some of them. I know who owned them 5 years ago." He tapped the paper. "And I know who owns them now. These names next to the dates, those are transfer dates." "Transfers how?" "That's what your father was trying to understand." He leaned back. "There's been a pattern across this part of the territory for the past 7 or 8 years. Families take on debt, sometimes debt they actually owe, sometimes debt that's been arranged. When they can't pay, the land transfers. Always to the same people, more or less. Different names on the paperwork, different front operations, but if you trace it back far enough..." He stopped. "Ostrander," she said. He looked at her. "Ostrander and whoever's behind him," she said. "That's what my father found." "What makes you say that?" "He kept a second list," she said. "I didn't bring it. It's in the house. It has Ostrander's name on it 6 times. Something moved in Rhett's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the feeling of a puzzle piece finding its place. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper on the table. "Your father's death," he said finally. "What were the circumstances?" "They said his horse threw him. He was found 3 miles north of town on the Palato Road." She kept her voice flat because that was the only way she'd found to talk about it since it happened. "He was an experienced rider. He'd ridden that road 100 times. When was this?" 4 months ago. "And the debts? When did they surface?" "The first notice came 6 weeks after he died." Rhett's jaw tightened, just slightly. 6 weeks, he said. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough," he agreed. She showed him the second list. He sat with both documents at the kitchen table while the afternoon heat settled into the house, and she went through the study looking for anything else that might matter. Her father had been methodical. Whatever he'd been building toward, he'd been building it carefully, in pieces, over time. There were survey notations that cross-referenced the property parcels. There were letters he'd received and kept from a territorial land assessor in Tucson that used careful and bureaucratic language to say, in essence, that certain records he'd inquired about had been difficult to locate. Difficult to locate because they'd been tampered with, she thought, or hadn't existed in the first place. She brought everything she found to the kitchen and piled it on the table beside Rhett's elbow. He looked up at the pile, then at her. "You've been sitting on all of this since he died," he said. Not quite a question. "I didn't know what to do with it," she said. "The sheriff, The sheriff works for the county and the county assessor is on Ostrander's board of directors, Rhett said. I found that out this morning. She sat down. The weight of it was not new. She'd been carrying it for weeks. But something about hearing it stated plainly, by someone who'd verified it independently, made it settle differently. Made it real in a way that her private knowledge hadn't quite been. So where does that leave us? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. There was something measuring in his expression, but not unkind, like he was trying to determine how much of the truth she actually wanted, as opposed to how much she was asking out of convention. Honestly? Please. In a difficult position, he said. This, he gestured at the papers, is enough to interest someone. A territorial judge, a federal marshal, someone outside Ostrander's reach, but getting it to them without it disappearing first, and without us disappearing first. He paused. That's going to take some thinking. What kind of thinking? The kind that takes a few days, he said. Which means, for now, you can't stay in this house. I live here. I know. I'm telling you what the situation requires, not what's fair. He said it without apology, but also without the kind of impatience that men usually deployed when they expected compliance and weren't getting it fast enough. Ostrander's men will come back. Tonight, probably, or tomorrow. Once he's had time to regroup and figure out that I actually looked at those documents and understand what's in them, he'll want to make sure the trail goes cold. She was quiet. You have options, he said. I'm not telling you what to decide, but I'd rather you were somewhere safe while we figure out the next move. We, she said. You and me, he said, unless you'd rather handle it alone. She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was getting darker as the afternoon light shifted west, and she hadn't lit a lamp. Outside, she could hear the cottonwoods moving in a small wind. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't. You knew my father for 2 weeks. That's right. So why? She stopped, started again. What do you actually want out of this? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, or was going to give her a version of the answer that was polished enough to be useless. Your father found the whole shape of it, he said. All of it, not just the piece that touched his land. If I'd been smarter, I'd have kept talking to him instead of moving on when the survey was done. He looked at the papers. He's dead. The work he did, the risk he took, is sitting in a drawer in a dead man's house, and the men who probably had him killed are still running the territory. He paused. That bothers me. It was not a heroic speech. It had none of the shape of heroism, no righteousness, no particular claim to the moral high ground. It was just a man describing an accounting problem that offended him on a level he couldn't leave alone. She thought it was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 4 months. All right, she said. I'll pack what I need. She was upstairs pulling clothes from the wardrobe when she heard the horses outside. Not one horse. Several. Moving fast, then stopping. She went to the window. The light was failing now, the sky going orange and violet over the flats to the west, and in that light she could see 3 men on horseback at the end of the road that led to the house. They were sitting still, which was almost worse than movement. One of them was the scarred man who'd come to tell her about the auction. She went back downstairs quickly but without running because she decided at some point in the past 4 months that she was done with panic. Panic was for people who still believed that the worst possible outcome wasn't the one currently unfolding. Rhett was standing at the kitchen window. He'd already seen them. Back door, he said. My father's papers. He'd already gathered them, she realized. They were in a roll under his arm, the way he'd carry a bundle of maps. She hadn't seen him do it. Back door, he said again. Not urgent, just clear. They went out the back and through the stand of cottonwoods, moving through the failing light toward where Rhett had left his horse tethered behind the neighbor's fence line. She heard behind them the sound of the front door being opened with more force than a knock would have managed. She didn't look back. She put her hand on the horse's neck for a moment, warm, solid, present, and then Rhett helped her up and swung up behind her, and they moved north through the cottonwoods, away from the road, away from the house where her father's books still sat on every flat surface, and his tobacco smell still lived in the study walls. She didn't cry. She'd thought she might, but she didn't. She held the horse's mane and watched the dark land open up ahead of them and thought about what her father had found and what it had cost him and what she was going to do with what he'd left her. The paper against her skin was gone now, transferred to Rhett's keeping along with the rest. But she had the numbers memorized. She'd had them memorized since the second day after she'd found them, because she'd known, in whatever part of her understood danger before the rest of her caught up, that she might need them without the paper. The territory stretched out dark and enormous under a sky that was turning from violet to black, and somewhere behind them lights were moving through her father's house, and somewhere ahead of them there was a reckoning that hadn't happened yet. She thought about what Rhett had said. That bothers me. She understood that. She was beginning to understand it very well. The horse moved north, and she kept her back straight because there was no point in slumping. And she thought about her father, and about the shape of what he'd found, and about the men who'd decided his finding it was a problem they needed to permanently solve. She thought about what it would take to prove all of it. She thought about what it would cost. And she decided, somewhere in the first mile of darkness between Darrow's Crossing and whatever came next, that the cost didn't matter as much as the accounting. Her father had believed in getting things right. She was, after all, her father's daughter. Rhett's ranch was 11 miles north of Darrow's Crossing, which was far enough from town to matter and close enough that a fast rider could reach it in under an hour. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridges, the kind of valley that collected wind in winter and held heat in summer, with a creek running along the eastern edge that was reliable 8 months of the year and a disappointment the other 4. The main house was log and stone, built low and wide, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a roof that had been repaired so many times in different places that it looked like a record of every hard season that had passed over it. Eliza had not said much on the ride north. Neither had Rhett. The horse moved steadily through the dark, and she sat in front of him with her hands in her lap and watched the black shapes of the land pass on either side. And she thought about the men going through her father's house and what they were looking for and whether they'd figure out what they hadn't found. They arrived past midnight. A hand named Cord, older, lean as wire, with the cautious movements of a man whose joints had strong opinions about cold weather, came out of the bunkhouse with a lantern when he heard the horse. "You're late," Cord said, holding the light up. He looked at Eliza. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes made a quiet adjustment. "You'll want the spare room made up." "She'll want it as it is," Rhett said. "Just leave a lamp." "There's food," Cord said. "We're fine." "I made it anyway," Cord said, and went back inside. The spare room was small and held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out at the dark ridge to the west. There was a quilt on the bed that had been washed enough times to go soft in a way that new things weren't. Eliza sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at her hands and tried to locate something like exhaustion, because she was tired enough that it should have felt like something. But all she could find was a buzzing wakefulness behind her eyes that wouldn't settle. She ate the food Cord had left, cold biscuits and the remains of a bean stew, neither of which were remarkable, and both of which were exactly what she needed. Then she lay down on top of the quilt without undressing and stared at the ceiling until the buzzing behind her eyes finally wore itself out. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, the window was gray with early light, and she could hear, from somewhere in the house, the sounds of men talking in low voices. She didn't go back to sleep. She got up, smoothed her dress as well as she could, and went to find out what was being decided about her life. Rhett and Cord were at the kitchen table with the papers spread between them and coffee going cold at their elbows. A third man was there. Younger, maybe 25, with a sunburned face and the kind of careful attention in his eyes that suggested he was smarter than he usually let on. His name was Webb, she'd learned later. He rode for Rhett and had been doing so for 3 years, and he had the particular loyalty of someone who'd been treated fairly when they'd had no reason to expect it. None of them had heard her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, and then Cord looked up. "Coffee's on," he said. It was not a warm invitation and not an unwarm one. It was a statement of available resources. "Thank you," she said, and went to pour herself a cup. She sat at the end of the table, which required moving a stack of papers to find a chair, and looked at what they'd laid out. Her father's lists were there, cross-referenced now with something else. A larger map, hand-drawn, with property boundaries marked in different inks. Rhett had been adding to it. "You slept," he said, without looking up. "A little. Good." He pointed at the map. "These parcels here, The ones your father marked. They run in a line, southeast to northwest, following the water rights along the Palato. You take those water rights, and you control who can run cattle in the whole middle section of the territory. And Ostrander controls them now, Webb said. Ostrander controls most of them, Rhett said. The ones he hasn't gotten yet are the ones where the owners have been resistant. He looked at Eliza. Your father's land was in this section. He wasn't a rancher, but the survey work he was doing gave him access to boundary records that nobody else had looked at carefully. He saw the pattern, she said. He saw the pattern, and he was building a case. Not a legal case exactly. He wasn't a lawyer, but an evidentiary one. Names, dates, parcel numbers. Enough that a territorial judge could issue an investigation order. Rhett leaned back. The problem is that the records he was working from, the originals, the county land office records, those have been altered. I'm willing to bet on it. What your father had was his own copies, made before the alterations, which is why they were valuable enough to hide. Eliza wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And now valuable enough to kill for. The three men were quiet for a moment. Yes, Rhett said. My father's death, she said. You think it wasn't an accident? I think a man who spent 20 years on horseback and knows every inch of the Palato Road doesn't get thrown on a clear night with no weather. He said it plainly, without softening, which she'd asked for and still found hard to receive. I think someone knew what he'd found. I think they moved quickly. She nodded, held the coffee, let the heat of the cup do something useful for her hands. So what do we do? She asked. There's a federal marshal, Cord said. He had the voice of a man who chose words carefully, which meant he didn't waste many. Name of Halbert, out of Tucson. He's not Ostrander's. How do you know? Eliza asked. Because Ostrander tried to buy him 2 years ago, Webb said, and Halbert arrested the man who delivered the offer. He said it with a small, dry satisfaction. That kind of thing gets around. Getting the documents to Halbert, Rhett said, is the problem. If we send a rider directly, Ostrander's people will intercept it. The road south is watched, has been for years. He keeps eyes on anything moving between here and Tucson. He picked up a pencil and turned it between his fingers, not writing anything, just moving it. We need someone who can carry it without looking like they're carrying anything. And we need time to copy the key documents, because the originals can't be the only record. I can write my father's hand, Eliza said. All three of them looked at her. Not forge, she said, but copy. I've been reading his handwriting my whole life. I know how he formed his letters, where he abbreviated, how he notated numbers. If we need duplicates that will hold up to scrutiny alongside the originals, I can make them. Rhett looked at her for a moment. You sure? I'm sure that sitting here waiting for something to happen is a worse option, she said. He held her gaze for another beat. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Start with the parcel list. I'll give you paper. She started that morning at the end of the kitchen table while the men worked around her. It was painstaking work. Her father's handwriting was precise and particular, and she hadn't written an imitation of it since childhood games, and her hand cramped by mid-morning in a way she hadn't anticipated. But she kept going, because the work was concrete and the rest of the situation wasn't, and she'd always found that concrete things were easier to be inside of than abstract ones. Webb watched her at one point, standing at the stove pouring himself coffee. Where'd you learn to write like that? He asked. He taught me, she said without stopping. Your father? My father believed that if you couldn't document something precisely, you might as well not have done it. She paused, dipped the pen. He used to say that a measurement recorded wrong was worse than no measurement at all, because at least a blank page told you the truth. Webb was quiet for a moment. Sounds like a careful man. He was, she said. And it killed him. She said it without heat. Just the fact of it, stated plainly, because she'd found in the weeks since his death that the most dangerous thing she could do was keep the anger soft and padded. Better to know its exact shape. Webb went back to what he was doing and didn't ask anything else. That afternoon, 3 riders appeared on the south road. Cord saw them first from the barn roof, where he'd gone to check a loose section of shingles. He came down fast for a man with bad joints and put his head into the kitchen doorway. 3 coming from town, he said. Not riders, I know. Rhett was already at the window. He watched the approaching men for a moment. They were still a quarter mile out, moving at a walk, not hurrying, which was either a reassuring sign or a careful one. "Eliza," he said, without turning around, "take the papers to the back bedroom. Under the floor. There's a board loose near the east wall, second one in from the corner. Lift it and put everything underneath." She gathered the papers, originals and her copies, and went without asking whether he was serious. She found the board, which required getting down on her knees and running her hand along the floor until she found the slight give of it, and she put the papers in the shallow space beneath and replaced the board and stood up and brushed the dust from her dress. She came back to the kitchen. "Stay in here," Rhett said. "I'd like to—" "I know what you'd like," he said. "Stay in here." She stayed in here. She could hear the conversation from the porch, voices carrying across the still afternoon air, though she could only make out words intermittently. One of the visitors had a flat, confident voice that she didn't recognize. Rhett's answers were brief. Cord's were briefer. After 10 minutes, she heard the visitor's horses turning and moving back south. Rhett came inside. His face was the same as it had been when he went out, which told her nothing. "What did they want?" she asked. "To inform me," he said, "that Callum Ostrander is filing a complaint with the county sheriff, alleging that I interfered with a legal debt proceeding and that I'm harboring a woman who absconded with private financial documents." She stared at him. "He's saying I stole the documents. He's saying the documents were part of the estate property, which is technically true in a narrow reading, and that removing them constituted theft." Rhett pulled out the chair he'd been sitting in before and sat back down with the particular heaviness of someone reassembling their patience. "He's also said that he's prepared to drop the matter entirely if the documents are returned and I pay a— he called it a fine. I'd call it a bribe. And if you don't, then the sheriff will come out here with a legal order." He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. "Which the sheriff will be happy to do, because it costs him nothing and inconveniences us considerably." "How long do we have?" 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at the table. "Which means we need Halbert in 4 days." Webb was standing by the window. He'd been there since the visitors arrived, watching the road south. "I can ride to Tucson," he said. "Leave tonight. I know a way through the Garnet Hills that nobody watches because nobody thinks a man would take it in the dark." "It's a bad road," Cord said. "It's a bad situation," Webb said. He looked at Rhett. "Give me the copies. Halbert gets copies. We keep originals here. If they come with a legal order, let them take the copies. They won't know the difference until they show them to someone who knew your father's hand." He looked at Eliza. "And by then, Halbert will already have the originals." Eliza understood what he was suggesting. The copies she'd made would serve as the decoy. The originals, her father's actual work, the real evidence, would travel separately, already in Tucson, already beyond Ostrander's reach. "The copies won't fool anyone who examines them closely," she said. "My imitation is good, but it isn't perfect." "Doesn't need to be perfect," Webb said. "Just needs to be good enough to hold their attention for 2 or 3 days." She thought about this, about the hours of cramped hand work at the kitchen table, about what it would mean if the plan didn't hold. "All right," she said. She went and got the originals from under the floor and gave them to Webb. He tucked them inside his coat in a way that suggested he'd carried things that needed hiding before. He left before dark, taking the north trail that looped wide around Darrow's Crossing and connected to the hill road that would eventually put him on the route to Tucson. Eliza stood on the porch and watched him go. Cord stood a few feet away with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was not optimistic, but had made his peace with that particular condition. "He'll make it," she said. Not quite a question. "Webb's harder to kill than he looks," Cord said. "Which is saying something because he doesn't look all that easy to kill." She almost smiled, not quite. "How long have you worked for Maddox?" 11 years, he said. "And before that?" He glanced at her sideways. "Before that I was doing things that don't make for good conversation." He shifted. "He gave me work when work was the thing I needed. That's about all I'll say." She nodded. Rhett came out from the house and stood on the other side of her, and the 3 of them watched the last light go out of the sky, and the stars come up one at a time over the eastern ridge. "Ostrander's going to know the documents are gone," she said. "His men went through the house. They didn't find anything, which means he knows we have them. He's going to move. Yes, Rhett said. He's going to come here. Probably. And the sheriff's legal orders that's just the front of it, the cover. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He had his arms resting on the porch rail, and he was looking at the dark land with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. Most men in his position, he said, would make a show of the legal channels first. It's cleaner. It gives him distance from whatever comes after if the legal channels don't work. He paused. The question is how much time he thinks he has. She thought about the three riders that afternoon, their calm, unhurried approach, the flat-voiced man's polite delivery of what was essentially an ultimatum. He's not panicking, she said. He still thinks he's in control. He's mostly been right about that for 15 years, Rhett said. He's not right now. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. Something more considered than a smile. No, he said. He's not. The night settled around them, and from somewhere along the creek a nightbird started up its call, insistent, repetitive, built for carrying across open ground. Eliza listened to it and thought about her father, who'd taught her to identify birds by sound before she could read, who'd believed that paying attention to the actual world was more useful than almost any other skill. She was paying attention now. To the darkness, and the papers hidden under the floorboard, and the rider heading south through the Garnet Hills, and the man standing 6 feet away from her doing his own kind of careful arithmetic. She didn't know yet if it was going to be enough. She suspected it was going to be a very close thing. Webb had been gone 2 days when the fire started. Eliza smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke with something wrong underneath it, something chemical and deliberate that didn't belong to any natural burning. She'd been at the kitchen table working through a second set of copies because she'd decided that 2 decoy sets were better than 1, and her hand had finally stopped cramping enough that the work was going faster. It was mid-morning, the light coming in flat and white through the east window, and she'd been so concentrated on the pen in her hand that the smell took a moment to register as something she should stand up for. She stood up. Outside, the small outbuilding that Rhett used for storing equipment and feed sat 40 yards from the main house, with smoke coming out of its single window in the particular thick and rolling way of a fire that had been helped along. Cord was already running toward it with a bucket. Rhett was coming from the barn at a different angle, and even at that distance, she could read the set of his shoulders. Not the urgency of a man surprised by an accident, but the tighter, colder movement of a man who'd already understood what he was looking at. She went out onto the porch. "Stay back," Rhett called without looking at her. She stayed on the porch. She watched them work the fire for 20 minutes, drawing water from the trough in relays, and she watched the outbuilding shed most of its roof before they got it under enough control that it stopped threatening the barn. The smell of it was harsh and stayed in the back of her throat long after the smoke thinned. When Rhett came back to the house, his shirt was wet and his face had a tightness around the jaw that she recognized now as his version of anger, contained, practical, pointed inward at the problem rather than outward at the air. "There were papers in there," he said. He went to the washstand and put water on his face. "Survey maps I'd bought from a county clerk 3 years ago. Copies of land transfer records I'd pulled before anyone thought to make them hard to pull." He reached for the towel. "Nothing that can't be rebuilt. But they knew it was there. They've been watching the property. Since before we got here, probably." He hung the towel back. "This is a message. They want us to know they can touch us. They want us sitting with that knowledge for a day or two before the sheriff arrives with his legal order." She thought about the calculated patience of it, the restraint. A man who'd operated in this territory for 15 years and was used to winning by attrition rather than confrontation. "He's not going to wait much longer," she said. "No." "Has Webb had enough time?" Rhett was quiet. She knew the answer was that he didn't know, and that not knowing was the part of this that was hardest for him to sit inside. "He's had enough time to reach Tucson," Rhett said. "Whether Halbert moves fast enough." He stopped. "That's not something I can calculate." She went back to her copies. It was still the most useful thing she could do, and usefulness had become, in the past several days, the only thing standing between her and a fear that she didn't have the room to feel yet. She rode her father's hand until the afternoon light shifted and Cord came in to start something for supper, moving around her with the careful efficiency of a man who'd learned to share a kitchen with whoever needed to be in it. "You eat enough?" he said at one point, not looking up from the stove. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She put the pen down. No, she said. Probably not. He put a plate next to her elbow 20 minutes later without comment. She ate while she worked, and it was the best meal she'd had in a week, which she suspected was not entirely about the food. The second day after the fire, the sheriff came. There were 4 of them, Dunmore and 3 deputies, riding in a line up the South Road at a deliberate pace that announced their official purpose. Eliza watched from the window. Rhett went out to meet them on the porch. She couldn't hear all of it. She heard enough. Dunmore served the legal order in the same tone he'd used in his office when she'd come to him. That profoundly regretful voice that committed to nothing. The deputies stood behind him with their thumbs in their belts and the expressions of men following instructions they hadn't been asked to understand. Rhett read the document. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, and then he said something she couldn't make out. Dunmore said something back. Rhett said another thing. Then Rhett opened his door and looked at her. They want the documents, he said. She brought out the copies. 2 sets, bound together with cord, the work of 4 days of careful imitation. She handed them to Rhett. He handed them to Dunmore. Dunmore handed them to a deputy, who put them in a saddlebag without looking at them. Dunmore looked at Eliza. His face did the thing it always did. The practiced regret, the genuine absence of any intention to act on it. Miss Hartwell, he said, I'd recommend you make arrangements to vacate your late father's property within the week. The estate obligations are based on a fraudulent debt instrument issued by a bank that doesn't exist, she said. She said it clearly and without particular heat because she'd had days now to practice saying it. I'm aware of my obligations, Sheriff. Dunmore blinked. Something moved behind the regret for just a moment, something that might have been discomfort. Then it was gone. The county assessor has reviewed the documentation and found it to be in order, he said. I'm sure he did, she said. Dunmore left. The deputies left. The dust from their horses settled back onto the road. Rhett stood on the porch and watched them go. He had his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly back, the posture of a man doing his best thinking. Eliza came out to stand beside him. Now they have the copies, she said. Now they have the copies, he agreed. How long before they realize? Depends on whether Ostrander has someone who knew your father's handwriting. If he does, maybe a day. If he doesn't, he tilted his head. Longer. But we should assume a day. And Webb? Yes, he said. And Webb. Webb came back that night. He came from the north, which was not the direction he'd left from, and he arrived on a horse that was not the horse he'd ridden out on. And when he dismounted in the dark outside the barn, his face had the particular gray exhaustion of someone who'd pushed through the kind of tiredness that makes a person's hands shake. Cord brought him inside and put food in front of him and coffee, and they waited while he ate because he clearly needed to eat before he could talk, and nobody pushed him. When he finally put the cup down and looked up, he said, Halbert has the documents. Rhett let out a breath. Just one. Controlled. You talked to him directly? I sat in his office for 4 hours waiting. Webb wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Man is careful. He doesn't move fast. But he read everything. He asked good questions. He paused. He asked about the Consolidated Land Bank specifically. Said he'd heard something about it. A complaint filed 18 months ago from a family in Maricopa County. Similar pattern. Same kind of forged debt instrument. It's not just this territory, Eliza said. No. Webb looked at her. Halbert thinks it's at least 4 counties. Maybe more. He's been trying to build a case for 2 years, but he couldn't find anyone willing to testify. And every document trail he followed went cold when it got near the county assessor's office. He paused again. Your father's records, he said they were the clearest evidence he'd seen. The parcel numbers match cases he already knew about. The dates align. She put her hand flat on the table. Not dramatically, just to have something solid under her palm. He's coming? Rhett asked. He's coming. He said a week. He needs to deputize additional men, and he needs to file with the territorial court for an arrest warrant, because he wants it done correctly, or Ostrander's lawyers will tear it apart. A week, Rhett said. I pushed for less. He said a week was the fastest he could move without cutting corners that would cost him in court. Webb looked at him steadily. He knows what he's doing. A week? 7 days. Eliza did the arithmetic that Rhett had already done. The copied documents in Dunmore's saddlebag would be identified as copies within a day, maybe 2. When Ostrander understood that the originals were already in Tucson, already in federal hands, the calculation changed. He would know the legal route was closed. He would know that waiting was no longer useful, which meant he would stop waiting. She said this out loud. All 3 men looked at her. "She's right," Cord said. "I know she's right," Rhett said. "So what do we do for 7 days?" Webb asked. Rhett was quiet for a moment, doing the kind of thinking that required stillness. Eliza watched him and thought about the outbuilding burning, about the careful patience of a man who'd been controlling this territory for 15 years through a combination of money and fear and the specific kind of institutional rot that happened when the same men sat in the same positions of power long enough to forget anyone could move them. "We don't stay here," Rhett said finally. 7 days on this property, outnumbered, waiting. That's Ostrander's best situation and our worst. He looked at the table. "We go to town." "That's his territory," Webb said. "It's everybody's territory," Rhett said. "That's the point." He looked at Eliza. "What do you know about the families on your father's list? The ones who lost land? Are they still in the area?" She thought. "Some of them. The Pruitt family. They're still in Darrow's Crossing. Marcus Pruitt runs what's left of his father's feed operation. The Garza family lost their east acreage 2 years ago, and I think they're still on what's left. There are others." "They've been afraid to talk," Rhett said. "Every one of them, because nobody's been able to offer them anything except more risk. And now? Now, there's a federal marshal coming with arrest warrants." He looked around the table. "That changes the math for people who've been afraid. It doesn't fix everything. Fear doesn't disappear just because the situation changes, but it moves." She understood what he was thinking. She'd been raised by a man who believed in documentation, in evidence, in the formal accumulation of verifiable fact. But she was also the woman who'd stood on an auction platform and watched 40 people look away, and she understood something about fear that her father, for all his precision, had perhaps underestimated. Fear didn't respond to evidence. Fear responded to numbers, to the feeling that the room had shifted, that the thing everyone had been pretending wasn't happening was being named out loud by enough people that the pretending became too exhausting to maintain. "You want to gather them," she said. "I want you to talk to them," he said. "You're Thomas Hartwell's daughter. They knew him. Some of them probably knew he was looking into this. If there's anyone who'll listen, they might listen to me," she said. It wasn't vanity. It was a calculation, the same kind Rhett had been making, and she made it cleanly. "But Rhett, if Ostrander hears we're talking to the families—" "He'll hear," Rhett said. "There's no version of this where he doesn't hear." He looked at her directly. "The question is whether what he hears worries him enough that he does something stupid." She held his gaze. She'd noticed over the past days that he looked at her that way, directly, without the slight deflection that most men used when talking to women about things they'd already decided. He looked at her the way he looked at Cord or Webb, like she was a person in the room whose thinking was relevant to the problem. She wasn't sure she'd been looked at quite that way before. She wasn't sure what to do with it. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," he said. They rode into Darrow's Crossing the next day at 9, which was late enough that the town was fully awake and early enough that the heat hadn't yet driven people indoors. Rhett rode beside her, and Cord rode behind, and Webb had gone ahead the night before to stay with a cousin in town, to have eyes on the street before they arrived. The main street of Darrow's Crossing looked the same as it always had. The same bone-colored buildings, the same 2-letter short saloon sign, the same group of men on the assayer's porch who watched everything that moved without appearing to watch anything. But she felt the difference as they rode in. Felt it in the way heads turned and stayed turned, in the particular quality of attention that a small town gives to something it hasn't decided yet, whether to fear or follow. She found Marcus Pruitt at his feed store, which was operating on the kind of narrow margin that required him to do everything himself. He was 40 years old, broad across the shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, with a face that had gone prematurely old in the way of men who'd been worried for too long about too many things. He looked at her when she walked through the door, and then he looked at Rhett behind her, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession. "Miss Hartwell?" he said carefully. "Marcus," she said, "I need to talk to you about your father's land." He glanced at the door. at the street outside. That's not a conversation I'm looking to have. I know. I'm going to ask you to have it anyway. She put both hands on the counter between them. My father documented everything, all of it. The forged notes, the transfer dates, the names on the instruments. He hid it. They killed him for it. A federal marshal in Tucson has the originals right now, and he's coming with arrest warrants in less than a week. Marcus was very still. I need you to be willing to stand up and say what happened to your family's land, she said. In public, when the time comes. In public, he said. In front of the town, she said. In front of Ostrander, if he's there. You understand what you're asking? Yes, she said. I understand exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to be afraid and do it anyway. She paused. My father was afraid too. He did it anyway. It cost him everything. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you it won't cost you something too, because I don't know that. She felt her voice go tight in a way she hadn't expected, and she steadied it before continuing. But there's a marshal coming, and I have my father's documentation. And if you come forward, you won't be alone. Marcus looked at her for a long time. Behind him, through the back wall of the feed store, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the town going about its morning. A wagon on the street, someone hammering somewhere, the distant voice of a woman calling a name. I've got a family, he said. I know. If this goes wrong, I know, she said again. I know. He put his hands flat on the counter, looked down at them. He had the hands of a man who'd worked land his whole life, broad, scarred, with the particular roughness that didn't go away even when the work stopped. Who else you talking to? He said finally. The Garzas. The widow Dunstable. Anyone else on my father's list who's still in the area? He was quiet for another moment. Then, Widow Dunstable lost 200 acres 4 years ago. She's been trying to prove it ever since. You should start with her. Eliza nodded. I'm not saying yes, Marcus said. I'm saying come back at the end of the week. All right, she said. She and Rhett left the feed store and stood on the boardwalk outside in the morning heat. He hadn't said a word the entire time she'd been talking to Marcus. He'd stood by the door and let her work, and she'd been aware of him there. Not intervening, not directing, just present in the particular way of someone who understood that the conversation required her and not him. The widow Dunstable, she said. I heard, he said. They walked further into town, and the morning got hotter, and at the corner of the main street and the side road that led to the church's old building, she saw two of Ostrander's men standing by a horse rail, not doing anything in particular, watching the street the way men watch when they're being paid to watch. One of them looked directly at her. She held his gaze for a moment, longer than was comfortable for either of them, and then she looked away and kept walking. Her father's voice in her head, You pay attention to what's actually there. What was actually there was a town that had been afraid for 15 years, and a man whose power rested entirely on that fear-holding. What was actually there was a federal marshal in Tucson with a file full of evidence and a warrant he was 7 days from delivering. What was actually there was the widow Dunstable with 200 stolen acres and whatever she'd been carrying alone for 4 years. What was actually there, Eliza thought, was enough, if they could hold together long enough to use it. The widow Dunstable lived on the western edge of town, in a house that had once sat on 400 acres and now sat on a lot barely large enough for a garden. Her name was Agnes, though she'd told Eliza in their first conversation that nobody had called her that in 20 years. She was Dunstable, had always been Dunstable, and the first name was something she'd packed away when her husband died and found she didn't need to unpack afterward. She was 61 years old, built narrow and angular, with white hair cut short and practical, and eyes that were the particular clear gray of someone who had spent a long time looking at things without flinching. She'd listened to Eliza for 40 minutes the first afternoon without interrupting once. Then she'd poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Eliza, and said, I've been waiting 4 years for someone to walk through that door. You knew what was happening, Eliza said. It wasn't quite a question. I knew what happened to my land, Dunstable said. I knew the note they showed me wasn't the note I'd signed. The amounts were different. The dates were different. I knew it the way you know something you can't prove. In your chest, before your head catches up. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I went to Dunmore. I went to the county assessor. I wrote a letter to the territorial land office in Phoenix and got back a form letter that said my concerns had been noted. She said it without particular bitterness, which was almost more striking than bitterness would have been. After a while, you understand that the machinery isn't going to work for you, and then you have to decide what you are without the land. What did you decide? Eliza asked. Dunstable looked at her steadily. I decided I was still myself, she said. The land didn't make me, and losing it didn't unmake me, but I want it back. She set the cup down. I want the record to say what actually happened. I want the men who did it to stand somewhere public and have their names attached to the thing they did. She paused. That's not about the land anymore. That's about something else. About the truth of it, Eliza said. About the truth of it, Dunstable agreed. She became, in the 5 days that followed, one of the most important people in what Eliza had begun to think of, privately, as the architecture of an accounting. Dunstable knew everyone. She'd lived in Darrow's Crossing for 38 years and had the particular social knowledge of someone who'd paid attention to people during that time as a matter of genuine interest rather than calculation. She knew which families had lost land and still carried the weight of it. She knew which ones had been too frightened to speak and which ones had been waiting for someone else to move first. She moved through town with the quiet authority of a woman who had decided she had nothing left to be afraid of. And the conversations she had in those 5 days, in kitchens and on porches and in the back rooms of the few businesses still operating independently in Darrow's Crossing, built something that Eliza could feel accumulating even when she couldn't see the whole shape of it. Rhett watched this happen with the focused attention of a man revising his understanding of something. He'd expected, she thought, to be the one doing the work, the visible part of it, at least. He was not a man accustomed to being in a supporting position, and she could see him adjusting to it in the small ways that adjustment showed. The slight reorientation of where he stood in a room, the way he asked questions instead of giving directions when she came back from talking to families. Dunstable's got 4 more families, she told him on the 4th evening, sitting at the kitchen table of the rooming house where they'd taken 2 rooms on the north end of town. The Carver family lost 60 acres in the Pilato Bottom 3 years ago. They've still got the original note Ostrander's man showed them. They kept it because the wife thought something was wrong and her husband didn't want to push it, so she just kept it, tucked it away. Rhett was quiet for a moment. That's a primary document. Halbert will want it. I know. She's willing to give it to him directly. Eliza rubbed her eyes. She was tired in the way that had become permanent over the past week. Not the sharp exhaustion of sleeplessness, but the duller, steadier kind that came from sustained tension. Marcus Pruitt came back. He said yes. What changed? His wife, she said. She told him she'd rather be afraid and moving than afraid and still. She thought about that for a moment. She's right, I think. Rhett nodded. He had his hands flat on the table and was looking at them in a way that meant he was looking at something else. Ostrander's been quiet, he said. 4 days. Nothing from his men, nothing from Dunmore, no movement on the legal order. That worries you. Quiet worries me more than noise, he said. Noise tells you what someone's doing. Quiet tells you they've decided something you don't know about yet. She thought about that through the night, lying in the narrow rooming house bed, listening to the town settle into its nighttime sounds. Ostrander had been in control of this territory for 15 years through a combination of money and patience and the careful management of people's fear. He would know by now that the copies Dunmore had taken were not the originals. He would know that the originals were in Tucson. He would understand, with the intelligence of a man who'd been playing a long game for a very long time, that his window for controlling the outcome through legal channels had closed. What she couldn't calculate was how a man like that chose to respond when the thing he'd relied on stopped working. She found out the next morning. She was crossing the main street on her way to Dunstable's house for their morning meeting when Webb appeared from between 2 buildings and fell into step beside her at a pace that communicated urgency without appearing to. Don't stop walking, he said quietly. She kept walking. Ostrander's men picked up cord last night, he said, on the North Road. He'd gone out to check on the ranch. Rhett asked him to ride up yesterday afternoon and make sure the property was secure. He didn't come back. She kept her face and her pace steady with a conscious effort. Is he hurt? Don't know. A man named Silas Bowes saw them take him. Bowes runs the overnight freight and was on the North Road around midnight. He came to find me at first light. Webb's voice was low and flat. They want leverage. They know they've lost the document angle. This is the next move. Rhett knows? He's the one who sent me to find you. She found Red at the back of the livery stable, out of sight from the street, with the look on his face that she'd come to understand meant he was very angry and was using all available resources to keep it functional rather than explosive. It was a particular kind of anger, cold and precise, without the heat that made men do stupid things, and she was aware that it took real effort and probably cost him something she couldn't see. "They'll send terms," he said when she reached him. "That's how this works. They take someone to make a point, then they send terms. Cord—" He stopped, started again. "Cord has been with me 11 years. He's not a young man, and he's not in good health, and whoever has him knows that." "Rhett." "I know," he said. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, a gesture she'd never seen from him, which told her something about the actual size of what he was containing. "I know. We don't trade the case for Cord. He'd tell me to go to hell if I suggested it." He dropped his hand. "But we have to move the tribunal up. Halbert isn't here yet." "I know he isn't here yet." He looked at her. "What we've built. The families, the testimony, the documents they're willing to bring forward. Does it hold if we move it up 2 days?" She thought about Dunstable, about the Carver wife with her carefully kept note, about Marcus Pruitt's hands flat on the counter, about the things she'd felt accumulating over 5 days that she hadn't been able to see the whole shape of until this moment. "Yes," she said, "it holds." "Then we do it tomorrow," he said. "We don't wait for Ostrander to set the terms. We move first." The rest of that day was the most concentrated piece of work Eliza had done in her life, including the 4 days of copying her father's handwriting until her hand cramped. She and Dunstable went door to door through the afternoon, not to the families they'd already spoken to, who were committed, but to the ones on the edges, the ones who'd been watching from a careful distance to see which way the wind was going. The message was simple, and they delivered it the same way each time. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the center of town. A public accounting of what had been done to the land and the people in this territory, with documentation, before witnesses, on the record. Some people said no. 2 households they'd had real hope for closed their doors, and one man told Eliza directly that she was going to get people killed and he wanted no part of it. She didn't argue. She thanked him for his time and went to the next house. But most of them said yes. By evening, she'd tallied 17 families willing to appear. 17, in a town of maybe 300 people, didn't sound like an army. But 17 families in a territory where silence had been the only available currency for 15 years was something else entirely. Dunstable walked with her back toward the rooming house as the light went orange and long across the street. They were both tired in the way that had gone past the point of complaint. "He'll try to stop it," Dunstable said. "Tomorrow morning, he'll do something." "I know." "Are you afraid?" Eliza considered the question honestly, the way Dunstable always seemed to expect honest consideration. "Yes," she said, "but it's a different kind of afraid than it was. It's the kind where you're going to do the thing anyway, so the fear is just weather, something you're in." Dunstable made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but had something of it. "Your father used to say something like that. Not in those words, but the shape of it." She paused. "He came to talk to me once, maybe 8 months before he died. Asked me about my land, about what I'd kept. I gave him everything I had." She was quiet for a moment. "I wondered afterward if I'd done the right thing, if I'd handed him a problem he wasn't equipped to carry." "He was equipped," Eliza said. "He just ran out of time." Dunstable nodded. They walked the rest of the way without talking. The terms came that night, as Rhett had predicted. A man knocked on the rooming house door at 9 o'clock. Not one of Ostrander's regular men, but a stranger, which meant Ostrander was being careful about what could be traced back to him. The stranger handed Rhett a folded paper and left before anyone said a word. Rhett read it, then passed it to Eliza. The note was brief and businesslike in the way that genuine menace tended to be. It said that a man matching Cord's description was being held at a location outside town, pending the resolution of certain legal matters. It said that Rhett's appearance before the county assessor's office at 8 the following morning, with a signed statement recanting any claims about the validity of the Hartwell debt documentation, would facilitate that resolution. It said that any other course of action would result in complications that the writer declined to specify in detail. Eliza set the paper down. "He's threatening you with something he can't put in writing," she said. "He's done it before," Rhett said. "To other people. He said it without elaboration, and she understood there were stories there she didn't know yet. He thinks I'll choose Cord. Won't you? Webb said from the corner. He said it directly, not as a challenge, just as a thing that needed to be looked at. Rhett looked at him for a moment. Cord wouldn't want me to. That's not what I asked. The silence held for long enough that it had weight. Rhett stood up and went to the window and looked at the dark street below. And Eliza watched him from across the room and understood that she was seeing something real, not the controlled, functional version of him that he kept assembled most of the time, but something underneath it that was less managed and more human and considerably more painful. No, he said finally, I won't trade the case for Cord. Because he understands what this is, what it means to the people here. He turned back from the window. His face had the tightness around the jaw again, but different now. Not just contained anger, but something that had cost more to arrive at. And because once you let a man like Ostrander set the terms, you've already lost. The only leverage we have is momentum. If we stop now, everyone who said yes goes back to being alone, Eliza said quietly. Yes. She thought of the 17 families. She thought of the Carver wife and her carefully kept note. She thought of Marcus Pruitt's wife saying, I'd rather be afraid and moving than afraid and still. Then we don't stop, she said. The morning arrived with the particular clarity that Arizona mornings sometimes had. The air still cool from the night, the sky a hard, clean blue before the heat got into it, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look more definite than it would by noon. Eliza stood in front of the rooming house at 9:30 and watched the first families arrive, coming from different directions, on foot and by wagon and a few on horseback, converging on the open ground at the center of town where the platform from the auction still stood. Nobody had taken the platform down. She hadn't thought about it until this moment. It was still there, still smelling of sawdust and old rain, still 4 feet off the ground with the rough railing along the back. She climbed it. It felt different from the last time. She hadn't thought it would. She'd thought it would feel like the same wood and the same height and the same open sky above it. But it was different in a way she couldn't quite name, something about the direction she was facing, or the reason she was standing there, or simply the fact that she'd chosen to climb it this time rather than been directed to. People gathered, more than she'd counted on. Beyond the 17 families, beyond the people she and Dunstable had spoken to, there were others. Townspeople who'd heard something was happening and come out of simple curiosity or something more than curiosity. She recognized faces from the original auction crowd, some of the same people who'd looked away that day. Dunstable stood at the front of the gathering with her arms crossed and her expression clear and steady, and when she caught Eliza's eye, she gave a single small nod. Rhett stood at the edge of the crowd, not on the platform. He'd been very clear about that. This is yours, he'd said that morning, and theirs. I stand with the crowd. She hadn't argued. She'd understood. She didn't have a speech prepared. She'd thought about preparing one and then decided against it, because her father had taught her that the most important things lost something when they were rehearsed. They acquired a smoothness that made people listen to the performance instead of the content. So she just said what was true. She told them about her father, about the survey work, the pattern he'd noticed, the documents he'd hidden. She told them about the consolidated land bank that didn't exist, about the forged debt instruments, about the 15 years of systematic theft dressed in the language of legal obligation. She said Ostrander's name clearly, out loud, in the morning air, and she felt the crowd shift when she did. A collective breath held and released. Then Marcus Pruitt stepped forward. He climbed the platform steps and stood beside her and told the crowd about his father's land, the specific acreage, the specific note, the specific day the men had come, and told his father that the debt was called and the land was forfeit. He was not a good speaker. His voice was unsteady in places, and he lost the thread once and had to find it again. But he said it, all of it, in front of 200 people in the morning light. Then the Garza family. Then a man named Hooper, who'd lost 40 acres to the east 5 years ago and had been so ashamed of losing it that he hadn't told anyone outside his family, carrying it like a private failure rather than what it actually was. He cried partway through, briefly, and then steadied and kept going. One by one, they came forward. The Carver wife brought the note, the original, forged note, and read the numbers from it aloud so the crowd could hear how they differed from what her husband had actually signed. Dunstable spoke last among the family witnesses. She stood on the platform and looked out at the gathered faces with her clear gray eyes and said, in a voice that required no adjustment for the crowd because it carried naturally, "I have been in this town for 38 years. I have watched good people lose what they built because powerful men decided that the law was a thing they could use like a tool and put down when they were done. I am 61 years old, and I am standing here because I would like the record to say something true before I'm done." The crowd was silent. Not the silence of people looking away. Something different. The silence of people who were present. It was into this silence that Ostrander arrived. He came with 6 men, all armed, riding in from the north end of the main street at a pace designed to be noticed. He was dressed well, as he always was. The expensive hat, the clean coat, the presentation of a man whose authority was self-evident and not in need of demonstration. He stopped his horse at the edge of the gathered crowd and looked at the platform and at the people around it with an expression that had been calibrated over many years to convey a specific message. "This is manageable, and I am the one who will manage it. This gathering," he said, loud enough to carry, "is in violation of a standing county order regarding public assembly without a permit. I'm asking everyone to disperse." Nobody moved. He looked at the crowd. The crowd looked back at him. Eliza, from the platform, watched him do the arithmetic. 200 people, 17 families on record, the documents already in Tucson, Halbert somewhere on the road from the south, and watched him arrive at a number that didn't work the way his numbers had always worked before. "Maddox," he said, finding Rhett at the edge of the crowd, "call this off." "It's not mine to call," Rhett said. Ostrander looked at Eliza. Something moved in his face. The first thing she'd seen in his expression that wasn't managed. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it. The look of a man recognizing for the first time and against his will that the room had changed and he hadn't changed with it. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was still controlled. "You're making a serious mistake." "I've been told that before," she said, "by men who turned out to be wrong." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at his men. And in that look, the slight uncertainty of it, the half-formed instruction that didn't quite arrive, the crowd saw something that Ostrander had spent 15 years making sure they never saw. He didn't know what to do next. It lasted only a moment. He recovered his expression, settled back into his saddle, said something to the man beside him that Eliza couldn't hear. But the moment had happened, and 200 people had seen it happen, and you cannot unsee a thing like that once it's in front of you. Dunmore appeared at the south end of the street 20 minutes later, moving without his usual deliberate pace, and behind him, in a group of 7 riders that resolved, as they got closer, into men wearing the badges of the federal marshal's office, came a broad, gray-haired man on a bay horse who rode with the particular unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had stopped being impressed by men who expected their money to make them untouchable. Halbert had made it in 6 days instead of 7. He dismounted at the edge of the crowd and looked at the platform and at Ostrander and at the assembled people with the expression of a man reading a situation he'd been briefed on but was seeing clearly for the first time. He reached into his coat and produced a document that he handed to one of his deputies, who walked it across to where Ostrander sat on his horse. Ostrander read it. His face, for just a moment, was completely unguarded. The mask that had held through 15 years of careful construction simply went, briefly and entirely, and what was underneath was not remarkable. Just a man who had believed for a very long time that he could not be touched, confronting the first clear evidence that he'd been wrong. Then he looked up at the 200 people watching him read his arrest warrant, and Eliza thought she saw, under all of it, something almost like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a man who has spent decades maintaining a fiction and has finally, irrevocably, run out of the energy required to maintain it. His 6 men did not resist. 3 of them, in fact, stepped back from him with a physical distance that communicated their intention clearly, which was the final piece of information Ostrander needed about how completely the ground had shifted. Cord was found that afternoon, held in a line shack 2 miles north of town, dehydrated and stiff, and in a foul temper that Rhett said later was the most reassuring thing he'd seen in a week. He was brought back to the ranch in the back of a wagon, wrapped in a quilt, complaining about everything available to complain about. Eliza sat on the wagon bed beside him on the ride back, not talking much because talking wasn't what was needed. And Cord wasn't a man who benefited from unnecessary company in the way some people did. But at one point, on the North Road in the late afternoon light, with the ridges going gold on either side of them, he turned his head and looked at her with the clear-eyed directness that was his particular mode of communication. "Heard you spoke first," he said. "I did." "Good," he said, and looked back at the sky, and didn't say anything else. The light was long and red by the time they reached the ranch, and somewhere behind them, in the town that had spent 15 years perfecting the art of looking away, the reckoning that Thomas Hartwell had started and not lived to see was finally, imperfectly, and at considerable cost, arriving at its due. The territorial court proceedings lasted 11 days. Eliza attended every session. She sat in the third row of the converted grain storage building, the old church still smelling faintly of wheat and dust, and watched the machinery of formal justice operate at the particular pace of something that had been delayed a long time and was now moving with the accumulated weight of everything it had been waiting to address. It was not dramatic in the way the platform testimony had been dramatic. It was slow and procedural and frequently tedious, with long passages of legal language that required concentration to follow, and longer passages of document examination that required patience to sit through. She sat through all of it. Halbert had been thorough in a way that went beyond what she'd hoped for. In the 6 days since the public tribunal, his deputies had pulled records from 4 county offices across the territory, cross-referencing them against her father's original documentation with a methodical precision that Thomas Hartwell himself would have recognized and approved of. What emerged from that cross-referencing was larger than even Rhett had estimated. Not 15 years of land theft, but closer to 20, reaching back to a period before Ostrander had become the visible face of the operation, when the scheme had been run by a man now dead whose estate Ostrander had inherited along with the methodology. 43 families. 43 families across 4 counties who had lost land they'd built and worked, through forged instruments and institutional complicity and the simple grinding pressure of being in a smaller position than the men who wanted what they had. When the prosecutor read that number into the record on the second day, the room went very quiet. Eliza looked at her hands in her lap and thought about her father at his desk in the evenings, bent over his maps and his notes, and understood for the first time the full size of what he'd been carrying when he died. Not just her family's situation, all of it. He'd seen all of it, and he'd known, and he'd kept working. She didn't cry in this courtroom. She saved that for later, alone, in the room at Rhett's ranch where she'd slept her first night in safety, sitting on the edge of the bed with the quilt bunched in her hands, crying for her father with the full and unmanaged grief that she'd been holding at arm's length since the morning they'd found him on the Palato Road. It took a long time, and it was not, in any sense, a release. Grief that size doesn't release. It just changes shape, becomes something you can carry differently. When it was done, she washed her face at the washstand and looked at herself in the small mirror above it and thought, all right. She went back to the courtroom the next morning. Ostrander testified on the 6th day. He'd retained a lawyer from Phoenix who was skilled and expensive and did his considerable best, but the documentation was too comprehensive and the witnesses too numerous for skill and expense to adequately address. Ostrander himself, on the stand, was a diminished version of the man who'd ridden into the tribunal with 6 armed men and a lifetime's confidence in his own untouchability. The bearing was still there, the expensive clothes, the controlled voice, but it sat on him differently now, like a coat that had been cut for a larger person. He admitted to less than the evidence showed. That was expected. What was not expected, or what surprised Eliza at least, was a moment near the end of his testimony when the prosecutor asked him directly about Thomas Hartwell, and Ostrander's counsel objected, and the judge overruled the objection, and Ostrander sat for a long moment in silence before answering. He said that he had not ordered Thomas Hartwell's death. He said it in a way that was technically a denial, and practically an acknowledgement that the question was not unreasonable to ask, and Halbert, sitting to Eliza's left, made a small notation in his file without changing his expression. The investigation into her father's death was ongoing. That was what Halbert told her when she asked, 3 days after Ostrander's testimony. It would take time. The evidence was circumstantial at present. He would not tell her what he expected to find because that was not how he operated. But he told her that the file was open and would remain open until there was a definitive answer. It was not the answer she'd wanted. She sat with it for a week before she understood that it was the only honest answer available, and that she preferred it to a false certainty offered to make her feel better. "He's going to find something," Rhett said. He said it one evening in late October, sitting on the porch of his ranch in the cooling air, not looking at her. "Halbert doesn't open files he can't close." "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said. "I don't know it." They sat with that for a while. The night had come on cool, and the stars were thick over the eastern ridge, and from down the creek she could hear the frogs that had returned when the water level came back up in early fall. "My father believed that the land told the truth if you knew how to read it," she said. "He used to say that to me. I thought he meant it about surveying, about the technical work." She paused. "I think now he might have meant something bigger." Rhett was quiet. "He meant that things have an actual shape," she said, trying to find the edge of it. "Regardless of what people say about them. The land sits where it sits. The water runs where it runs. You can build a fence in the wrong place and call it the right place, but the watershed doesn't change. The elevation doesn't change." She looked at the dark ridge. He believed that if you paid enough attention to what was actually there, you could find where the lies were, because the lies don't fit the shape of the actual thing. Rhett turned his head and looked at her. He had his coffee on the rail beside him, and the lamplight from inside was coming through the window behind him, and she could see his face well enough to see the particular quality of attention he gave things he was actually thinking about. "That's what he was doing," Rhett said, "with the surveys, with the parcel records." "He was reading the shape of it," she said, "finding where the lies didn't fit. And you're doing the same thing." She considered that. "I'm trying to," she said. "I'm not as good at it as he was." "You're better at some parts of it," Rhett said. He said it without decoration, as a simple observational fact, and she understood that it was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was something more precise than that, an accounting. She looked at him for a moment. There were things between them that hadn't been said, and she'd become aware of them gradually over the past weeks, the way you become aware of furniture in a dark room, by the fact of almost walking into it. She didn't know exactly what shape those things were yet, and she didn't think this was the moment to try to find out, and some part of her was honestly relieved to leave them for later, because later implied a future in which there was time for such things, and the existence of that future was still new enough to feel fragile if handled carelessly. "I need to go back to the house," she said. He knew which house she meant. "When?" "Soon, after the sentencing." She'd been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, in the small spare room, and the arrangement had been so practical in its necessity that the question of when it would end hadn't quite come up. "I need to go back and decide what I'm going to do with it, what I'm going to make of it." "It's a good house," he said. "It is," she said. "My father built it well." The sentencing came on the 11th day. Callum Ostrander received 12 years at the territorial prison in Yuma. 3 of his business associates received sentences ranging from 4 to 8 years. The county assessor, whose cooperation had made the scheme functional for 2 decades, received 9 years and was escorted from the courtroom by 2 of Halbert's deputies, with the look on his face of a man who had believed, until the very last moment, that his cooperation with the prosecution would translate into something more favorable than it did. Percy Alden, the mild-voiced auction man, had turned state's evidence early and received a suspended sentence in exchange for testimony that proved more valuable than anyone had initially expected. He left Darrow's Crossing within a week of the sentencing, and nobody who watched him go expressed much opinion about where he was headed. The land restorations began in January. It was not a simple process. 20 years of fraudulent transfers and layered shell ownership didn't undo themselves cleanly, and the territorial court appointed a land commissioner to work through the parcels one by one, matching documentation against Halbert's compiled records and the evidence provided by the affected families. Some cases were straightforward. Others were contested by parties who'd bought land in good faith from Ostrander's various front operations and had legitimate claims of their own that had to be weighed against the original owner's rights. It took time. It was imperfect. Several families recovered their full acreage, several recovered partial. A few, whose original deeds had been destroyed and whose claims rested primarily on testimony, got less than they deserved and knew it. Agnes Dunstable recovered 160 of her original 400 acres, which was not what had been taken from her and which she accepted with the particular pragmatic composure of someone who had spent 4 years practicing the difference between what was owed and what was available. "It's not right," Eliza said to her, standing outside the land commissioner's office after the determination. "No," Dunstable agreed, "but it's more right than yesterday." She tucked the paper into her coat. "I've learned not to hold out for perfect. Perfect takes too long and costs too much and usually arrives after you've stopped needing it." Eliza thought about that for a long time after. She thought about it while she was going through her father's study, finally, in February, sorting what to keep and what to let go. She thought about it when she found, in the back of the bottom drawer, the same drawer where she'd found the hidden list, a letter her father had started and never finished, addressed to no one. That began, "I have been thinking about what we owe each other in places like this, and I believe the answer is more than most of us manage." He hadn't finished the thought. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted or lost the thread, or simply set it down, meaning to return to it. She put it in the pile of things to keep. Marcus Pruitt stopped by the house in March with 2 of his farmhands to repair the fence line along the east property, which had deteriorated badly in the year since her father's death. She hadn't asked him to. He showed up one morning with posts and wire and a brief explanation that the fence being down was an inconvenience to his own cattle operation and that fixing it was therefore in his interest, which was a practical framing that she understood to be the way Marcus Pruitt expressed generosity without having to use that word. She made coffee for all 3 of them and listened to the sound of the fence going back up and thought that this was what recovery actually looked like. Not a moment, but an accumulation of small, concrete acts performed by imperfect people who decided to be present to each other's lives. Rhett came in April. He came on a Tuesday, mid-morning, riding the same horse he'd ridden the night they'd left together, and he dismounted at the gate and tied the horse to the post her father had put there 30 years ago and walked up to the porch where she was working through a stack of correspondence from the land commissioner's office. She looked up. "I was in town," he said. "Darrow's Crossing is 4 miles south," she said. "I came the north way," he said, which meant he'd come 11 miles out of his way, and they both knew it, and neither of them commented on it directly because that was not how either of them operated. She moved a stack of papers off the second porch chair. He sat down. She went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat on the porch in the April morning with the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves in the thin, warm wind, and for a while they didn't say anything, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about being in his company, the absence of pressure to fill silence with words it didn't need. "Cord's joints are giving him trouble," he said eventually. "I heard. Webb told me when he came by last week. He won't complain about it." "He wouldn't. I told him to take easier work. He told me to mind my own affairs." He held his coffee in both hands. "He's been asking about you. Won't ask me directly. Asks Webb, who tells me." She smiled. It was a real smile. Not the careful kind she'd been deploying in public for months. The one that communicated competence and steadiness and all the things that people who'd decided she was a leader needed to see from her. Just a real one, in the April morning on her father's porch. "Tell him I'm well." "He'll know I saw you." "Yes," she said. "I imagine he will." Rhett set his cup on the porch rail. He looked at the cottonwoods and at the flat land beyond them that opened up in every direction toward the pale horizon. She watched him look at it and thought about what she'd said to him in October about her father reading the shape of things, and thought that Rhett did something similar, that whatever his particular form of attention was, it was the real kind, the kind directed at what was actually there rather than what was convenient to see. "I've been thinking," he said, "about staying closer to Darrow's Crossing." "Your ranch is 11 miles north," she said. "I know where my ranch is," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the cottonwoods, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was working toward something he hadn't fully decided how to say. The slight tension around the eyes, the jaw slightly set, the general appearance of a man who'd navigated a great many difficult terrains and found this particular one unexpectedly resistant to his usual methods. She found it, she realized, genuinely endearing. This man who'd walked through a hostile crowd and stopped an auction with 9 words, who'd carried her father's documents through the dark on a borrowed horse, who'd held his anger functional and cold when they'd taken Cord, and the cost of that was written plainly in his face if you knew how to read it. This same man could not quite find the approach to a sentence on a porch, on a Tuesday morning in April. "Rhett," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It wasn't a declaration exactly. It was more like an orientation, a statement about where she was in the landscape, offered to someone who might find it useful. "The house is mine. The land is mine. I'm going to rebuild what my father started, and I'm going to keep working with the land commissioner on the remaining cases, and I'm going to be here." She paused. "That's what I know right now." "That's enough," he said. "To know." "Is it enough for you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, simply and without ornamentation, the way he said things that he actually meant. She nodded, picked up her coffee. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. She thought about what her father had written and never finished. What we owe each other in places like this. She thought she understood it better now than she would have a year ago, better than she would have if none of this had happened. You couldn't answer that question in the abstract, what people owed each other in hard places. You could only find out by being in the hard place and watching what people actually did. Some looked away. Some closed their doors. Some showed up with fence posts on a Tuesday without being asked. Some rode 11 miles out of their way and called it being in the neighborhood. None of it was clean. None of it resolved into a simple lesson about the goodness or badness of people, or the reliability of justice, or the eventual reward for doing difficult things. 43 families, and some got their land back, and some got less, and a few got nothing but the public record of what had been done to them. A man who'd probably arranged her father's death was sitting in Yuma for 12 years on fraud charges while the murder investigation moved at its own pace toward an answer she might not live to receive. Agnes Dunstable had 160 acres and was already talking about what she was going to do with them. The territory was not fixed. It was less broken than it had been, and moving in a direction that was better than where it had come from, and that was the most honest accounting available. It was, she thought, enough to work with. The cottonwoods went on moving in the wind, and the coffee went cold, and Rhett stayed until mid-afternoon and then rode back the way he'd come. And Eliza sat on her father's porch for a while after he left and listened to the ordinary sounds of the land, the wind, the birds, the far-off sound of Marcus Pruitt's cattle somewhere to the east, and let herself exist inside the present moment without trying to see past it. She was 22 years old. She had a house and a father's work to finish, and a territory that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, and at considerable cost, to look at what was actually there. That was where she would start. That was, she thought, exactly where her father would have started too.